She saw it coming. Before the fairy tale, before the cameras, before the whole world fell in love with a 19-year-old kindergarten assistant who didn't know what she was walking into. Princess Anne watched her brother's engagement unfold in February 1981 and recognized something most people missed, not because she was cruel, not because she was jealous, but because she'd spent 30 years learning exactly what royal life demanded, and she could see, with painful clarity, that Diana Spencer had no idea. Here's what Anne said at the time, in a conversation with her mother about the match. Charles is older than his years, and Diana is younger than hers, which makes it worse. That single sentence, 16 words, and every one of them turned out to be true. But this isn't a story about tearing Diana down. This is a story about what Diana walked into, the impossible role, the crushing expectations, the woman across the family table who understood exactly why it wouldn't work. Anne was right. History proved it. But understanding why she was right means understanding what Diana never had a chance to learn. Diana Frances Spencer was born on July 1, 1961, the third daughter of the 8th Earl Spencer. Her childhood looked like privilege from the outside. Country estates, aristocratic connections, the kind of breeding that made her an acceptable candidate for the heir to the throne. But the surface deceived. Her parents' marriage collapsed when she was 6 years old. Not quietly, brutally. A custody battle that tore the family apart, with Diana's mother Frances leaving and her father John winning the children. Diana grew up in the aftermath of that rupture, raised primarily by her father, shuttled between boarding schools where she never quite fit. She attended Riddlesworth Hall and then West Heath School. Academic achievement proved elusive. Diana failed her O-levels twice, not for lack of intelligence, but perhaps for lack of focus, lack of stability, lack of whatever it is that allows a child of divorce to concentrate on examination questions. She left school without the qualifications that might have led to university. A brief stint at a Swiss finishing school followed, but it didn't take. By her late teens, Diana was back in London, sharing a flat in Coleherne Court with friends, working part-time as an assistant at the Young England Kindergarten in Pimlico. She was kind. Everyone who knew her said so. She was wonderful with children, patient, warm, present in a way that suggested she understood their vulnerability because she'd felt it herself. She was photogenic in that particular English rose way that photographers loved. And she was of appropriate breeding, which in 1980 still mattered enormously to those who decided whom princes could marry. What she was not, by any measure, was prepared. Diana had never held a serious job. She'd never managed staff, navigated bureaucracy, handled pressure from any direction except her own family's dysfunction. She knew how to move through aristocratic circles, which fork to use, how to address a duke, but she had no comprehension of what life inside the palace actually required. The difference between attending royal events and being a royal was something she would learn only by living it, and by then, it would be too late. To understand why Anne saw the danger so clearly, you have to understand where Anne came from. The contrast between these two women wasn't just temperamental, it was foundational. Anne Elizabeth Alice Louise was born on August 15, 1950, the second child and only daughter of Princess Elizabeth. 18 months later, her mother became queen. Anne didn't grow up near royalty. She grew up inside it. She watched the red boxes of state papers arrive every day. She observed the scheduled audiences, the public appearances, the countless moments when personal feelings got swallowed in service of institutional stability. Her education happened first with tutors at Buckingham Palace, then at Benenden School in Kent, a boarding school known for rigorous academics and character formation. By the time Anne reached adulthood, she'd absorbed decades of preparation for a life that would never truly belong to her. She understood in her bones that being royal wasn't a privilege to enjoy, but a duty to perform. The crown wasn't a gift, it was a weight. Diana would learn this too, but she'd learn it the hard way, under the glare of cameras with no preparation, married to a man who didn't love her, judged by a sister-in-law who'd known from the start it wouldn't work. Before Diana entered the picture, Anne had already established exactly who she was. The moment that defined her character came on March 20th, 1974, when a white Ford Escort forced her limousine to a halt on Pall Mall, just 200 yards from Buckingham Palace. A man named Ian Ball emerged from the vehicle carrying 2 handguns. Within moments, he'd shot Anne's chauffeur, her protection officer, and a journalist who tried to intervene. Then Ball wrenched open the door of the royal limousine and announced his intention to kidnap the princess. Anne was 23 years old, married to Captain Mark Phillips for just 4 months. 4 people were bleeding on the street. An armed man was grabbing her arm and ordering her out of the car. Her response? Not bloody likely. She didn't scream, didn't collapse, didn't wait to be rescued. She physically struggled against her would-be kidnapper, pulling herself back through the car toward the opposite door while Ball tried to drag her out. A former boxer named Ron Russell happened to be passing by, saw the commotion, approached the car, and punched Ball in the head. That gave Anne the moment she needed to escape. 4 people wounded, 1 princess unharmed, and a reputation that would define her for the next 50 years. Here's the part that matters. Anne didn't perform victimhood afterward. She gave no tearful interviews about her trauma. She didn't leverage the incident for public sympathy. She simply returned to her duties. That quality, the absolute refusal to be anyone's spectacle, anyone's victim, anyone's commodity, would shape every decision she made from that point forward. It was also the quality Diana would never develop. Not because Diana was weak, but because Diana was human in a way the institution couldn't accommodate. 3 years after the kidnapping, on November 15, 1977, Anne made the decision that would prove most prophetic. She gave birth to her first child, a son named Peter. The birth was historic for a reason that received remarkably little attention at the time. Peter Mark Andrew Phillips became the first grandchild of a reigning British monarch in over 500 years to be born without a royal title. This wasn't an accident. Under the letters patent issued by King George V in 1917, grandchildren of a sovereign through the male line automatically received His Royal Highness and became princes or princesses. But children of a princess who married a commoner followed different rules. No automatic entitlement. Titles only if the monarch explicitly granted them. Queen Elizabeth II offered to grant such titles to Anne's children. Anne and Mark Phillips declined. There's more. Before the wedding, the Queen had offered Mark Phillips an earldom, standard practice when a commoner married into the royal family, since it would allow their children to hold courtesy titles. Phillips refused. With no title for the father and Anne declining individual titles for the children, Peter entered the world as simply Master Peter Phillips. When Anne's daughter Zara was born on May 15, 1981, just 2 months before Charles and Diana's wedding would captivate the planet, she too arrived without royal style, Miss Zara Phillips. Think about what this decision meant. In 1977, when Anne declined titles for her son, Diana Spencer was a 16-year-old schoolgirl who hadn't yet appeared on anyone's radar. This wasn't Anne reacting to Diana's later problems. This was Anne's pre-existing understanding of what sustainable royal service required. She was saying, through action rather than words, that the trappings of royalty could be burdens rather than privileges, that visibility could damage rather than elevate, that the greatest gift she could give her children might be the absence of a crown. Anne understood something in 1977 that Diana would spend the rest of her life learning. There's a difference between the fairy tale and the job. The fairy tale destroys you. The job just requires showing up. Lady Diana Spencer's engagement to Prince Charles was announced on February 24, 1981. She was 19 years old. The transformation from kindergarten assistant to global celebrity began immediately. The formal preparation she received for her new role reportedly consisted of a few briefings from palace staff and some sessions with a voice coach. That was it. No extended apprenticeship, no gradual introduction to public duties, no opportunity to learn the unwritten rules that governed royal behavior, no mentor to guide her through the labyrinth of protocol, precedents, and institutional politics. Diana later acknowledged in interviews that she felt desperately unprepared. But by the time she could articulate what she'd needed, the damage was already done. From her position across the family table, Anne would have recognized the danger immediately. Here was a young woman whose emotional openness had charmed the press, whose photogenic vulnerability was generating unprecedented coverage, who seemed to believe that being loved by the public was the same thing as doing the job. Anne had spent her entire life learning that these were not the same thing at all. Public adulation is ephemeral. Institutional duty is permanent. Cameras are predators rather than friends. The fairy tale narrative the press was constructing around Diana bore no relationship to the actual demands of royal life. But Anne said nothing publicly. She gave no interviews expressing concern. She didn't leak reservations to friendly journalists. That wasn't her way. She simply returned to her own work, raising her untitled children in relative obscurity, while Diana's every outfit, every emotional fluctuation, every rumored conflict became international news. The wedding happened on July 29, 1981. An estimated 750 million people worldwide watched Diana walk down the aisle of Westminster Abbey in an ivory silk taffeta gown with a 25-foot train. The most elaborate bridal procession in modern British history. The coverage was breathless, romantic, hyperbolic. The wedding of the century, the fairy tale princess, the redemption of monarchy through the magic of young love. Anne attended, of course. She sat in Westminster Abbey with the rest of the royal family, watching as Diana became the Princess of Wales and assumed a role for which she had no preparation and even less understanding. What Diana felt in those early months, we know from her own later accounts. Isolation, confusion, the dawning realization that the prince she'd married was in love with someone else, the discovery that the institution she'd joined had rules nobody had explained and expectations nobody had outlined. She was drowning, and nobody was throwing her a rope. And across the family table sat Anne, competent, composed, watching it unfold with what Diana likely perceived as coldness, but was perhaps something closer to resigned recognition. Anne had seen this coming. She just couldn't say so. The friction between Diana and the royal family became visible almost immediately, and nowhere more clearly than during the annual retreats to Balmoral. For Anne, Balmoral was home. She'd spent every August and September of her childhood there, tramping across the Scottish Highlands, learning to shoot and fish and ride. The estate's rhythms were second nature to her, the stalking parties that began at dawn, the long walks through heather-covered hills, the formal dinners where conversation followed unspoken rules about what could and couldn't be discussed. Anne thrived in this environment. She was outdoors, active, surrounded by dogs and horses, and the kind of structured tradition that felt like comfort rather than constraint. Diana was miserable. She didn't shoot, didn't fish, found the endless outdoor expeditions exhausting rather than exhilarating. The shooting weekends that Anne looked forward to all year left Diana bored, isolated, searching for something to do, while everyone else marched off into the Scottish mist. She was a city girl trapped in a country estate, a modern young woman surrounded by rituals that hadn't changed since Victoria's reign. The dinners were worse. Diana didn't know the rules, didn't understand when to speak and when to stay silent, which topics were appropriate and which were forbidden, how to navigate the intricate dance of royal conversation where saying the wrong thing could freeze you out for an entire evening. Anne moved through these gatherings effortlessly. She'd been doing it since childhood. Diana felt like an outsider at her own family table. The contrast was devastating. Here was Diana, the woman the world adored, the most photographed person on the planet, feeling inadequate because she couldn't keep up with her sister-in-law on a grouse moor. And here was Anne, overlooked by the press, dismissed as dowdy and difficult, completely at ease in the environment that was slowly crushing Diana's spirit. Anne watched this. She said nothing. But she saw a young woman who didn't fit, who would never fit, struggling against an institution that had no interest in bending to accommodate her. Throughout the decade that followed Diana's arrival, two radically different models of royal womanhood played out in parallel, and the British press made certain everyone noticed. The tabloids loved a contrast. They called Anne the Workhorse and Diana the showhorse. The framing was crude but not entirely inaccurate. Anne approached royal duty like a job. Show up, do the work, go home. Diana approached it like a performance. Every appearance an opportunity to connect, to be seen, to be loved. The numbers told one story. Year after year, the court circular, the official record of royal engagements, showed Anne completing more public appearances than almost any other member of the family. More than 500 official engagements annually. Over 300 patronages with organizations ranging from the Save the Children Fund, which she'd served as president since 1970, to numerous military regiments and professional associations. 500 engagements a year. Every year. For decades. Anne traveled to places that generated no press coverage whatsoever because her measure of success was organizational impact, not column inches. She wore the same outfits repeatedly because clothes weren't the point. She gave interviews rarely because she had nothing to sell. She simply did the job, day after day, year after year, while cameras pointed elsewhere. Diana's numbers told a different story. Fewer official engagements, but infinitely more coverage. Every outfit analyzed, every hairstyle discussed, every interaction with the public captured and broadcast worldwide. When Diana visited a hospital, it was front-page news. When Anne visited the same hospital a week later, it was a paragraph on page 12. The fashion contrast became symbolic. Diana worked with designers, understood the power of image, used clothing as communication. The revenge dress she would later wear, that black off-the-shoulder Christina Stambolian number on the night Charles's confession aired, showed a woman who understood exactly how to weaponize a photograph. Anne, by contrast, famously recycled outfits for decades, once joking that she didn't care what she wore as long as it was practical. The press mocked her for it. Anne didn't care about the mockery either. But here's what the workhorse versus showhorse framing missed. Diana's approach wasn't vanity, it was survival. Diana had discovered that public love was the only love reliably available to her. Her husband was distant. Her in-laws were cold. The institution treated her like a breeding vessel and a photo opportunity rather than a person. The cameras loved her when nobody else did. Can you blame her for loving them back? The tragedy was that the cameras would eventually consume her. Anne saw this coming too. Diana's impact was real and should not be dismissed. Her willingness to hold AIDS patients without gloves in 1987, at a time when fear and stigma surrounded the disease, did more to shift public perception than any number of official statements could have. She sat on the beds of the dying. She touched the untouchable. She communicated through gesture what policy documents could never achieve. Anne wouldn't have done it that way. Anne's approach was institutional. Work through organizations, build structures that outlast any individual. Diana's approach was personal. Connect human to human. Make the abstract concrete through the power of a princess's touch. Both approaches had value, but only one was sustainable. Diana had no private life, no boundary between her public role and her personal self. No way to turn off the spotlight she'd learned to court. The love she received from crowds was real, but it was also conditional, dependent on her continued willingness to perform, to reveal, to give pieces of herself away. Anne maintained boundaries that Diana had never learned to build, and without those boundaries, Diana was being eaten alive. The late 1980s and early 1990s brought the War of the Waleses into the open, and Anne watched it unfold with what must have been a mixture of vindication and horror. The marriage that had never truly worked was now visibly disintegrating. Charles and Diana had stopped pretending. They attended events separately. They briefed journalists against each other through intermediaries. They turned their private misery into public entertainment, each side leaking damaging stories about the other. And then the tapes emerged. In August 1992, Squidgygate exploded across the British tabloids. Someone had intercepted a private phone call between Diana and her close friend James Gilby, recorded on New Year's Eve 1989. The transcript was excruciating. Gilby calling Diana Squidgy 53 times. Diana complaining about her treatment by the royal family. Intimate conversation that was never meant to be heard by anyone else, now splashed across every newspaper in the country. A few months later came Camillagate, an intercepted call between Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles from 1989, equally intimate, equally humiliating. The future King of England caught on tape making comments so embarrassing that newspapers debated whether they could even print them. Anne said nothing. Think about what it took to maintain that silence. Her brother's marriage was collapsing in the most public and degrading way imaginable. Tape recordings of private conversations were being published in newspapers. The monarchy's reputation was being shredded daily, and Anne, who had every right to defend her family, to criticize Diana's participation in the media war, to express some opinion about the catastrophe unfolding around her, chose to remain silent. That silence wasn't coldness, it was discipline. Anne understood that adding her voice to the chaos would only create more noise, more headlines, more damage. The institution needed people who kept their heads down while others lost theirs. That was the job. That was always the job. The same year the tapes leaked, journalist Andrew Morton published Diana, Her True Story, a devastating account of Diana's unhappiness that had been secretly authorized by Diana herself. The book detailed her struggles with bulimia, her suicide attempts, her isolation within the royal family, her husband's ongoing relationship with Camilla. It was a nuclear strike against the monarchy, launched by the Princess of Wales herself. Anne kept working. 500 engagements that year, 300 patronages, head down. No comment, no counter-briefings, no attempt to tell her side or defend her brother or criticize her sister-in-law. Because that's what duty looks like when it's real. The year 1992 brought everything into the open. Queen Elizabeth II would memorably describe it as her annus horribilis. 3 royal marriages collapsed in spectacular fashion. The Duke and Duchess of York separated amid scandals involving photographs nobody wanted to see. Charles and Diana separated amid mutual recriminations that would soon spill into public view, and Anne herself divorced Mark Phillips after reports of his infidelities and the emergence of an illegitimate daughter he'd fathered with another woman. 3 divorces, 3 different approaches to public crisis. Sarah Ferguson's approach was chaotic and commercially minded, eventually costing her any significant role in royal life. Diana's approach was strategic and media-savvy, positioning herself as the wronged victim of a cold institution, and she wasn't entirely wrong about being wronged. Charles had never stopped loving Camilla. The palace had treated Diana as disposable from the moment she'd produced an heir and a spare. She had legitimate grievances, and she knew how to communicate them. Anne's approach was characteristically silent. She said nothing to the press about her marriage's failure, gave no interviews explaining her side, offered no public grievances against her ex-husband. She just moved forward. On December 12, 1992, months after her divorce was finalized, Anne married Commander Timothy Lawrence in a small ceremony at Crathy Kirk in Scotland. Far from the London press corps, the New York Times covered the event with a headline about the quiet Scottish ceremony. 30 guests, a knee-length white suit, no global broadcast, no commemorative merchandise, no fairy tale coverage. Anne had fallen in love again. She got married. She got on with her life without making it anyone else's business. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. Diana's separation was generating headlines worldwide. Her pain was public property. Her strategic leaks to journalists were beginning the campaign that would culminate in the most explosive royal interview ever broadcast. November 20th, 1995. Diana sat down with Martin Bashir on BBC's Panorama and did something no senior royal had ever done. She told her side of the story on national television. Nearly 23 million British viewers watched her speak candidly about her marriage, her struggles, her desperation. "There were 3 of us in this marriage," she said, "so it was a bit crowded." She talked about Charles's relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles, about her own struggles with bulimia and depression, about feeling abandoned by the institution she'd joined, about the isolation, the coldness, the sense that she'd been used and discarded. It was riveting television. It was also a nuclear bomb dropped on the monarchy's reputation. What Diana said was largely true. Charles had maintained his relationship with Camilla throughout the marriage. The palace had been cold. The institution had failed to support her. She had struggled with eating disorders and depression. She had been desperately lonely in one of the most scrutinized marriages on earth. But the act of saying it, publicly, on camera, to 23 million people, crossed a line that Anne would never have approached. Not because Anne was more loyal than Diana, but because Anne understood something Diana never grasped. The institution would survive. Diana would not. By going to war with the palace publicly, Diana won the battle of public opinion, but guaranteed she would never find peace within the system. She couldn't go back, and she couldn't fully leave. Anne's response to this explosive broadcast was characteristic: silence. She gave no counter-interview defending her brother. She offered no public commentary on Diana's claims. She simply continued working, continued showing up, continued demonstrating through action what royal service looked like when it wasn't performed for cameras. The Panorama interview accelerated the final collapse of Diana's marriage. Queen Elizabeth II wrote to both Charles and Diana in December 1995, urging them to divorce. The decree was finalized on August 28, 1996. Diana was free and trapped. No longer a royal wife, but forever a royal mother. No longer bound by palace protocol, but forever pursued by the cameras she'd cultivated. She had nowhere to go that wasn't watched, nowhere to hide that wasn't photographed, no future that wasn't defined by her past. Diana's death came in the early hours of August 31st, 1997. A car crash in a Paris tunnel. Paparazzi motorcycles in pursuit. A driver with alcohol in his system. A back seat without seatbelts fastened. She was 36 years old. The news reached Balmoral before dawn. The royal family was there for their annual Scottish retreat, the same estate where Diana had once felt so isolated, so out of place. Now the family gathered in shock, while Prince William and Prince Harry, just 15 and 12 years old, absorbed the news that their mother was dead. The public response was overwhelming, an outpouring of grief that startled even those who'd tracked Diana's extraordinary popularity. Flowers piled outside Kensington Palace, crowds wept in the streets, and almost immediately, the mood turned against the royal family. Where was the Queen? Why hadn't she returned to London? Why was the flag at Buckingham Palace not flying at half-mast? The week between Diana's death and her funeral, September 1st through September 5th, 1997, became its own kind of crisis. The public wanted visible mourning. They wanted the Queen to appear, to speak, to demonstrate emotion. They wanted the Union Jack lowered over Buckingham Palace in tribute to Diana. The palace resisted. Protocol dictated that only the royal standard flew over Buckingham Palace, and only when the monarch was in residence. No flag at half-mast was possible under existing rules. The Queen believed her place was with her grieving grandsons at Balmoral, not performing sorrow for cameras in London. Anne was at Balmoral too, supporting her mother, helping with William and Harry, watching as public anger mounted against the family for failing to demonstrate the kind of visible, performative grief that Diana herself had always provided so naturally. The irony was brutal. The public was demanding that the royal family behave like Diana, emotional, visible, willing to perform their private feelings for a watching world. They were demanding the very approach to public life that Anne had spent 50 years rejecting. Eventually, the Queen relented. A special flag was flown at half-mast. The Queen returned to London. She gave a televised address praising Diana. The family adapted to the unprecedented outpouring of public emotion. Anne attended Diana's funeral on September 6, 1997. She walked in the procession behind the coffin with other members of the royal family. She maintained composure while crowds wept and threw flowers and called Diana's name. Whatever Anne thought about Diana, about the circumstances that led to that tunnel in Paris, about the media relationship that had consumed and ultimately destroyed her sister-in-law, she kept to herself. She had never publicly criticized Diana in life. She would not do so in death. Here's what the decades since have proven. Anne's philosophy wasn't just personal preference, it was prescient. Peter Phillips, her untitled son, built a career in sports management and marketing. He lives a life of relative normalcy despite being the Queen's eldest grandchild. Zara Tindall, her untitled daughter, became an Olympic silver medalist in equestrian eventing at the 2012 London Games. She competed under her own name, celebrated for what she accomplished rather than what she was born into. Neither child has become a tabloid fixture. Neither requires the kind of security or public funding that attends life as a working royal. Neither has written a tell-all memoir. Neither has given explosive interviews about family dysfunction. In December 2023, Zara spoke publicly about what her mother's title decision had meant. I was obviously very lucky that my mother didn't give us any titles, so I really commend her on that. We were very lucky that we got to do it a bit our own way. Do it a bit our own way. That phrase captures exactly what Anne provided. Space. Freedom. The absence of the spotlight that had destroyed Diana and continues to generate crisis after crisis in the modern royal family. Anne herself, reflecting on the decision years later, offered characteristically terse vindication. I think most people would argue that there are downsides to having titles, so I think that was probably the right thing to do. No elaboration, No self-congratulation. No implicit criticism of those who made different choices. Just the quiet confidence of someone whose judgment had been proven correct by time. So what did Princess Anne really think about Diana's suitability to be queen? She never said. Not directly. Not in the explosive quote that would make for perfect television. But that silence is itself an answer. Anne understood that some things shouldn't be performed for cameras. That institutional loyalty meant not saying the thing everyone wanted you to say. That the way you handle difficult truths reveals more about your character than the truths themselves. She looked at a 19-year-old with no preparation, no understanding of the job, no comprehension of what she was walking into. And Anne recognized that this would not end well. Diana is younger than her years. That was as close to a warning as Anne would ever give publicly. Diana was younger than her years, and the institution gave her no time to grow up. It demanded she perform as a princess before she'd learned what that meant. It thrust her into the spotlight without teaching her how to survive it. And when she found her own way to survive, through the cameras, through the coverage, through the public love that substituted for private warmth, the institution punished her for it. Anne saw all of this in 1981. She watched it unfold for 16 years, and she never said a word, because saying the word wouldn't have helped. Diana needed support, not warnings. She needed training, not judgment. She needed someone inside the palace to teach her what Anne had spent 30 years learning. She didn't get that, and it killed her. Anne's vindication is real. Her judgment was correct. Her approach to royal life has proven sustainable in ways Diana's never could. But vindication and tragedy can coexist. Anne was right about what Diana wasn't ready for. That doesn't mean Diana deserved what happened to her. While the media manufactured feuds and fairy tales and tragedies, Anne simply showed up. Day after day, year after year, decade after decade. 500 engagements a year. 300 patronages. Head down. No drama. No tell-all interviews. No revenge dresses. No Panorama confessions. The cameras eventually moved on to other stories. The tabloids found new princesses to build up and tear down. But Anne remained. The mainstay, who never needed vindication because she never needed validation in the first place. History proved her right. She just never mentioned it. That's the difference between spectacle and service, between performing the role and actually doing the job, between chasing the fairy tale and understanding that the fairy tale was never real to begin with. Diana was younger than her years. Anne saw it in 1981. She's still not talking about it. And that silence might be the kindest thing she ever did. Subscribe for more stories like this.